are strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong.
So, what's going on here? Joseph is he's in prison with Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. While he's in prison with them, he has interpreted the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. He predicts, of course, you'll recall that the cupbearer will be restored to his position in 3 days. And then the baker gets all excited and says, well, tell me what my dream means. And he says, well, in 3 days, you're going to die. And the birds are going to eat your flesh. And it happened exactly as he said. 2 years later, after the cupbearer had been restored, Pharaoh has some troubling dreams, and none of his wise men could interpret those dreams. And the cupbearer remembers Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, and so he tells Pharaoh about Joseph. Joseph is summoned from prison to go and interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and we are in the midst of that story. And so we'll pick it up in verse 17 where we stopped last time. And I'll actually back up to verse 16. Joseph answered the Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And we talked a little bit about the fact that the word favorable there, at least as I understand this text, is not saying that God's going to give you an answer that you like or give you the answer that you want, but he is going to answer you as you desire. In other words, what Joseph is saying is, well, I can't do it. It's not in me to do it, but God will give me the information that you would like, and I'll give it to you. And so Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, in my dream, behold, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. And behold, 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. And lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such as I had never seen for ugliness in all the land of Egypt. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. Yet when they had devoured them, it could not be detected that they had devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. And I awoke. I also saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears, full and good, came up on a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. And read magicians there as my wise men, my serpents, my magi, however you want to understand that. Just the people who were practitioners of the arts and considered to be wise that counseled him. Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. And so basically he says, okay, to begin with, you need to understand that there's not a difference. It's 2 different images that are picturing exactly the same thing. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. And the 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt. And after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. And now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. And I'm going to stop there. Let's talk about this for just a moment. Okay, so the general breakdown, simple enough. 7 really prosperous, abundant years. Egypt for the next 7 years is going to do very, very well. Those 7 years will be followed by 7 years of just horrible famine. The kind of a famine that would completely erase any semblance of the prosperous years before it. That's the whole point. You'll remember about the dream that Pharaoh's describing. He says that the 7 ugly cows come and devour the sleek and fat cows, but when they got finished devouring them, you couldn't tell that they had done it. There was no sign of the sleek and fat cows once the 7 gaunt and ugly cows showed up and consumed them. So this is going to be a terrible, terrible famine. Now, what is the general practice of most people? Times are good. How do we live? Like it's going to go forever. Especially a couple of years into it. And then when difficult times come, we don't have lots stored and prepared for the difficult times. What we generally find ourselves in is in a lot of debt. Because in these good times, not only do we spend what we have, but what else do we do? We spend on the future. We think this is going to go on forever and it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and I'm going to get more next year than I had this year, so I can go ahead and spend some of that now. And we borrow money on the future. And then when things turn around, and by the way, we're kind of going through an adjustment in our economy right now. Good news was, if you didn't hear today, the Fed decided that they were not raising interest rates again, and they hinted that next year they're going to be lowering them. Market reacted very positively to that. But anyway, we're actually dealing with a very minor version of this. Wasn't a 7-year prosperous time frame. And we haven't had just disastrous economy on the backside of it. But it's enough of a problem that when interest rates started going up, what happened to people? They started having trouble making their payments because they borrowed money thinking, I'm always going to be making what I'm making, and this much is always going to be coming in, and the interest rates are always going to be low. And then less money started coming in, and the interest rates went up. And so expenditures increased and income decreased, and that created a problem. That is the way that most people behave. I think it's generally and I'm going to use this term accommodatively, it's a natural thing. It's what we do. And if we have a good year of hunting, we don't say, hey, we need to ration our meat because next year we may not get anything. We assume that next year we're going to get as many as we got this year. And so we eat sumptuously. This happened in a huge way in the United States in the late 1920s and into the 30s. Up until that point, the golden age of the United States happened in the teens and the 20s. And people lived big and they lived large. And they spent lots of money and they had lots of parties and they bought really, really nice clothes and expensive things, and then the economy turned. And then right after the economy turned, what happened? There was a terrible drought that lasted so long that it created what was known as the Dust Bowl. And my grandparents lived through that age. And so my grandparents were always very cognizant of saving and being prepared for future trouble. But my generation doesn't think that way so much, because my generation largely lived in a time frame where there was great prosperity until the late 70s, and then some of us experienced a little bit of it in the late 70s and early 80s, hardship and difficulty, but not to the extent that had been experienced. And so when we came roaring back in the late 80s and 90s, we thought, hey, we fixed this problem. And we have not really, I mean, we've had some downturns. I've lost my retirement like 3 times now. It went all the way back down to my initial investment. 3 times now in my lifetime. The last one just a few years ago. So we have experienced this to a degree, but to a very minor degree for very short periods of time. 7 years is a long time to be in a drought. We had a drought this past summer, wasn't even 7 months long. And you heard all the whining and crying about it. We're talking about a 7-year drought. What happens when you cannot grow crops for 7 years? People starve to death. Animals starve to death. And if animals starve to death, not only are you losing the plant crops, but you're also losing what? Meat. Things were going to be terrible. So was God being mean or spiteful by making these things known to Pharaoh? That's the question. How many of you would welcome the news if someone came to you and said, hey, I want you to know, you're fixing to get a new job, and there's going to be a big raise that comes along with it, and you're going to have that job for 7 years, and then at the end of 7 years, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose your car, you're going to lose your family, and you're going to lose all your money. And it's going to be so terrible for the next 7 years that you're going to forget about these good 7 years that I just told you about. How many of you would say, hey, well, thank you for bringing me that news. I appreciate it. I wanted to hear good news like that. I'm guessing that Pharaoh wasn't overjoyed with this explanation. But the question is, why tell him? Well, okay, let him plan and let him figure out what he's going to do. And for those that are watching online that may not have heard her, the last part of that was she said, for God. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. Were the Egyptians people that followed God? No. So why is God making this known to Pharaoh? Okay, Joseph, he just met Joseph. At this point, Joseph is nobody in Pharaoh. In fact, what Joseph is at this point is what? An inmate in Egypt. So From Pharaoh's standpoint, why does this matter? Well, it doesn't really to Pharaoh. And God isn't trying to protect Egypt. And that's my point. I want us to understand. Now, when we pray to God and ask Him to preserve us, what do we expect? Okay, let me ask it in simpler terms and in pieces. When we pray to God about our jobs, what do we ask for? Let's say we've got a big interview coming up. We ask for success. How do we define success? It's a good answer. How do we define success? Okay, I want to get the job. I don't think about this in terms of I'm going to pray for my sustenance and God's going to give my ungodly neighbor a job. Do I? When I pray for health, what do I think? That I'll be healed. Not that I'll pass away. That's not what I'm looking for. What I want you to understand is God isn't doing this to Pharaoh and to Egypt for Pharaoh and for Egypt. Who is He actually preserving? And we're going to see this develop, but what we need to understand is God is doing this to help Israel. But when you look at it on the surface, He's not telling Israel these things. He's telling Pharaoh in Egypt these things. But God doesn't do things necessarily the way that we think they ought to be done. He knows more than we do, and He understands things more than we understand, and He preserves people in the way that is best. Okay, so this is kind of a tertiary lesson in this. Sometimes the way to help me is for someone else to do well, who then in turn is going to be in a position to do what? Assist me in some way that I need. That's what we see play out in this when you look at this whole story. Egypt is prepared so that Egypt has something to share with Israel and his sons. Why didn't God skip the middleman? Why didn't He just tell Israel? Come on, somebody's got to have an idea. I don't have an idea either. You know what my answer to that question is? Because this was the way it needed to be. He loves everyone.
Maybe He was going to give them a chance to better themselves and change and help Israel.
Sure.
Like heroes.
He constantly gave people the opportunity to do that. They didn't always do it. In fact, usually we don't do it. And prosperity usually has the exact opposite effect on us. When we are prosperous and things are going well in our life on the earth, we tend to think less about God, not more about God. That's why we're told over and over and over again, or warned, I should say, over and over and over again throughout the scriptures to be cautious about the love of money and about being too enamored and putting too much confidence in the flesh. Because when do we put confidence in the flesh? When we think it's solving all of our needs. I put confidence in my body when my body's healthy. When my body's not healthy, what do? I realize, wait a minute, I need help from somebody outside to help to sustain me. But when I feel healthy, I don't ask anybody for help. The same is true spiritually. What we have to understand, though, is that, well, I'll say it this way. You'll recall in the book of James, there's that section that says, or warns us, I guess, about saying, well, I'm going to go down to such and such a city and conduct business for a year and make a profit, but that instead what I should say is what? If the Lord wills, I will do this or that. Okay? The Lord's will was to supply Egypt and allow Egypt to help Israel, not to supply Israel. Now, we can break this down and make all kind of assumptions about, well, Israel was in this situation and in this place, and they weren't as prepared and able to do what, and all that may be true, or it may not be true. It may just be a guess. Doesn't really matter. What I'm going to suggest to you is that this is the way God did it, so this is the way it needed to happen. And sometimes the way God works is indirectly. For instance, the gospel, which all people need, right? And this is, in a sense, this whole story here is a shadow for the gospel. The gospel is going to be salvation to all men. But does God come to each person individually and speak the gospel to them? No. Never. Never one time. Not one single time ever in the history of the Bible. Or I should say in the history of the New Testament. In salvation in Christ. Is it handled that way? Even the Apostle Paul, who did speak to the Lord and saw the Lord, was told he needed to do what? Go into the city where someone would do what? Tell him words by which he must be saved. He wasn't saved by seeing Jesus, and Jesus didn't say, this is what you need to do in order to be saved. He was sent to a man who shared words of salvation with him. Same thing with Philip and the eunuch. An angel was sent to Philip to tell Philip to go talk to the eunuch. Could that angel have been sent to the eunuch to tell him what he needed to do to be saved? I suppose it could have. That's the way God wanted to do it. But that's not what God does, is it? God has entrusted the gospel in earthen vessels, and we are obligated. So, in this, if we take this as a metaphor for our time, those of us that have the information supplied by God and can prepare are Christians, right? That's parallel to the Egyptian role. What's Egypt have to do? Well, help the ones that are not prepared. Share what they have with the ones that are not prepared. What's our role? Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. It's important for us to recognize how God is working. God could have spoke directly to Pharaoh, but he didn't. Instead, he spoke through who? Joseph. We have to understand these things. That's why we have prophets. That's why we have teachers and preachers. These are all roles that were set in order by God himself. This is the way he wants it done. And that inherently makes it the right way. And the only way that it works. I don't need to question his wisdom. What do I need to do? I need to listen to it. So listen to what we get into as we go on here. So he tells him, look, he told you this twice. He told you twice so that you'd understand it's certain to happen and it's going to happen quickly. Let Pharaoh take action. Let Pharaoh appoint overseers in charge of the land. Let him exact a fifth of the produce, this is verse 34, of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. What is a fifth? In percentage terms. 20%. Essentially, what the solution is Pharaoh, you need to put people in charge of collecting a 20% across the board tax on everything that's produced for the next 7 years. Then let them gather all the food for these good years that are coming and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority and let them guard it. Let the food become as a reserve for the land, for the 7 years of famine which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish during the famine. For the next 7 years, there is a 20% tax on everything that is produced in the land. It's to be stored and kept under guard so that when the famine arrives, you're prepared. Now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all of his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? I'm going to stop for a minute here, make another observation that I think is worthwhile. You see how quickly he responded to this? He listens to it, he thinks it's a reasonable plan, and he says, all right, let's put it into practice. That's a good idea. Why is it that people are much more receptive to being told what to do when it comes to preserving their health or preserving their wealth, the material things that they're concerned with? But if you tell them what to do about their spirit, what do they say? I mean, what'd they do to Jesus? They killed him. What'd they do to Stephen? They killed him. Paul at one point talks to a group of people and asks them the question, because of the anger that they are having in response to him, have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Why is it that we are so much quicker to accept counsel about material things and we refuse to accept counsel about spiritual things? Why? It's real simple. We're much more concerned about the one than the other. You have a heart attack. Now, I know there's some exceptions to what I'm fixing to say, so don't say, well, I knew so-and-so. And I realize that there's always exceptions. But the average reasonable person has a heart attack, ends up in the hospital, they live through it, and the doctor says, you need to make some diet changes, and you need to make some behavior changes. And what do people do? They try to make those changes, at least for a while, until they think their body's healthy and they go, I don't need to worry about that anymore. I'm healthy. And then they revert back to what they want to do because they're putting confidence in the flesh. But that's another story. I digress. He was quick to listen to this advice. When Moses goes in and gives the advice, God says, let my people go. The Pharaoh in Moses' day says what? Who is God that I should listen to him? This Pharaoh says, hey, your God says that's a good idea. That's gonna save our lives. When it's not about saving their lives, who's God that I should listen to him? Not the same leader, but the same place, the same position, just a different focus. That is generally what happens. We listen to newspapers, we listen to doctors, we listen to television newscasts, we listen to folks that we don't even know at the coffee shop when they give us advice about how we can make more money. But when someone talks to us about what we need to do to save our soul, we say, who are you to tell me I have to change? So anyway, just make that observation. Pharaoh very quickly says, can we find a man like this who has a divine spirit? What's that question really about? Who's he talking about? Joseph. Joseph has just come to him and said, I can't help you, but God will tell me what your dream means. Joseph tells him this. God says that this is what your dream means, and this is what you need to do. And he says, well, am I going to find another man that has a divine spirit within him that can tell me these kinds of things? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. And so Pharaoh not only believes Joseph, but basically says, Joseph doesn't say you should appoint me, and God doesn't even tell Pharaoh through Joseph, you should appoint me, just that you should appoint someone. And Pharaoh's like, well, my wise men couldn't tell me any of this stuff that you just told me. Am I going to find anybody that's more discerning than you? So I'm going to appoint you over everything. In fact, I'm putting you in charge of everyone. The only thing that is not under you is my throne. That's it. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And that, my friends, is how a foreigner becomes the ruler in Egypt. Pharaoh took off his signet ring, put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him in garments of fine linen, put the gold necklace around his neck, and he had him ride in his second chariot. And they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. I want you to understand what that means. That means that when Joseph traveled, the people were obligated to bow down before him. He wasn't in Air Force One, he was in Air Force Two. Okay, wasn't in Chariot One, he was in Chariot Two. But when he passed by, they proclaimed, bow the knee. And people were expected to bow before him. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. I am Pharaoh, okay? I understand that. And though that's true, Joseph, what I want you to know is, nothing happens in this land without your approval. You can't even raise your hand unless it's passed by Joseph and Joseph says, yeah, it's okay. Pharaoh named Joseph Zephanath Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. He became Egyptian royalty overnight. He went from jail to supreme commander overnight. Was that for Joseph? Is God preserving Joseph? Is that what's going on here? You remember a couple of chapters ago when the blessings were being given out? Which one of the sons got the blessing? Judah. See, we're still all about preserving Judah. So that promise that was made to Abraham, that was made to Isaac, that was made to Jacob, who became Israel, and then was made to Judah, could come to pass. That's what God's doing here. Why didn't he just make Judah ruler in Egypt? You picking up a theme here? See, if I'm Judah, I might be thinking, wait a minute, if this is all about delivering me, why am I not in that place? Wearing the linen and the gold, having the signet ring, living in the palace, marrying the daughter of the goddess. I'm still here at home taking care of the sheep. Who's being helped in their eyes? Joseph is being helped in their eyes, but this is how God is preserving his promise. And I'm not even going to say his people at this point, because God preserving his people is always ultimately about preserving the promise, not the people for their own sake. Even in the book of Numbers, when the generation that did finally enter into the land at the end of the book, he points out to them, look, this is not happening because of how great you are. This is happening because of God's faithfulness to his promise. So what he's doing here is he's making a way for his promise to come to pass. Joseph comes to realize that later. We're going to find that as we get into that later on toward the end of this story, which is way over in chapter 50. It's rich with material. How long it's going to take us to get there, I'm not sure. But Joseph's finally going to come around and go, wait a minute. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And another way to say that is what you meant to do evil with, God used for good. And not for him, but to fulfill the promise, to make it possible. There is about to be 7 years of drought. How is he going to make sure that the sons of Israel have food? Well, Joseph's in Israel. If Joseph makes Israel wealthy and then can use his influence to preserve his family, problem solved. Verse 44, moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh named I already read that, got that part. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. And during the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. So this is all very smart and very efficient. Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Good thing, too. All right, I got to stop. We're past time to stop. will not be here on the 20th. What's the following Wednesday? The 27th? So on the 27th of December, unless whoever teaches this class next week teaches from this material, I will plan on picking up in verse 50 at that time as we continue this amazing story of God's providence. And what I want us to understand, I guess in short conclusion here, is God's providence is ongoing even if it doesn't look like it to us. To someone looking at this from the outside with no information about Joseph's prophecy, it looks like Egypt is doing well. They would never have said, oh, this is Israel being preserved. But in fact, God was preserving them, even though they didn't realize it. In fact, where did they think Joseph was, by the way? Most likely dead. You have a question? Yeah. Rome played an important role in things too, even though it looked like.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to